Good morning. My name is Dan Holdridge. I'm a survivor of September 11th at the United States Pentagon. I currently live in Deerfield, New Hampshire with my wife and 12-year-old son. So September 11th, I was working for a company called General Dynamics, and I was doing my dream job of working on computer networks. So that morning, it was a beautiful morning that morning, September 11th. It's a Tuesday morning, and I was I was on a conference call that morning. I usually had conference calls every Wednesday with this one particular client and or vendor, and she asked if she could have it on a Tuesday morning, and I mentioned that because it's significant. It delayed me, and that delay was pretty important. Um, once I finished that conference call, the lady called me back and said, "Did you hear about New York?" And I hadn't, and she had said that a plane hit the trade centers, and so I'm like, "That's horrible! What a horrible accident!" And I think that's what a lot of people first thought. And then as we spoke a little bit longer, she then said, "You'll never believe this. A second plane hit the other trade centers." So one was an accident, two were at war. And so I did what a lot of people did. I hung up with her and I called home. I spoke to my dad and I said, "Dad, it looks like our nation's at war." And he couldn't believe me. And it was just like, "Dad, look on the internet. It's a there's planes flying into buildings. I mean, it's horrible. But don't worry, I'm in the Pentagon. It's a fortress." And as I was trying to convince him, I realized I was trying to convince myself that I was going to be okay. And so I hung up with my dad, and that was nearly the last time I spoke with him. And then after that, I met up with my colleague Bobby Shelby, and Bobby and I uh, we had worked together at the Pentagon for quite a few months, and so we decided that we were going to go down to the Naval Command Center, which is on the first floor. Cell phones will only work on the fifth floor. It's the largest. Um, those such a large building, and the walls were so thick that only cell phones would work in the top floor. So as we're heading down to the first floor, Bobby asked if he could take a smoke break, and I don't smoke, but I said, "Sure, go ahead." That delayed us as well, and so as he started, you know, smoking a cigarette, I started reading my cell phone browser about New York. And as I was explaining to Bobby how horrible that must be, I turned to him and said, "Geez, Bobby, what's next? The Pentagon?" And then three, two, one, boom, the blast went off. And it picked Bobby and I up and threw us a great distance. And then the building came down on top of us. It's still really hard. I know it's 18 years, but it feels like 18 minutes. Um, Once the building came down on us, when Bobby and I came to, when we woke up from the blast, we crawled out of the rubble and we went to a nearby pillar where we thought it would hold up because the rest of the building was coming down. And we looked to the right, the outermost of the Pentagon, and that's when we saw that flames were coming at us from the explosion. And so we went to the left, the center courtyard area. And so that's kind of that's how we were able to get out. And then once we got to the center courtyard, I'm not in the military. I never was. I was a contractor, so I didn't know what this military stuff was of explosions and the like. And I had a person run by and yell, "You've been hit! You know, you've been hit!" And I had no idea what that was, but I looked down and I was covered in blood and soot from the blast. And so I knew I was in trouble. But I sat down, and that's when the pain started to set in. And then I realized two things that happened. One is I had a clipboard that day, and I was able to flip it, and it covered my face, which was an absolute blessing that happened. And then I had my cell phone, which was smashed from the cement. So when I was sitting out in the courtyard, I couldn't call anyone and tell them I was alive. So One of my colleagues saw me, and he had a two-way radio, and he was able to. Uh, I could hear them asking if I was alive on the radio, and so I grabbed it and I just said, "I'm alive," and so is Bobby, and Bobby Shelby, the guy that was next to me. You see, everyone else next to us didn't survive. Uh, it was just us, and so that's a pretty hard thing to live with. Bobby and I had gotten up and we went underneath a nearby bridge and we huddled. And that's when a woman named Erin Anderson came and found us. Erin Anderson was at her house and she just felt she had to help someone. And so she came down and she saw Bobby Shelby and I on the side of the road bleeding. And she said, "Get in, take us to the hospital." And so she was a guardian angel for me. And so we got in and that's how we got out of the area for the Pentagon. One of the things, though, I want all of you to take from it is not how awful the day was, because I think you can tell that from any video or any story that you hear about it. You're going to hear, especially I'm sure you heard from the other 9/11 survivors in New York, there's an element of fear that's created when terrorists do what they do. One of the biggest things that we can do to change that tide of terrorists and creating fear in others is to do good for each other. It's to change the way we think about how we do things, how we treat each other. And so one of the best things that we can do is change that and instead share some love for one another. Look out for each other. Be good to each other. That's what we can do to prevent other terrorist attacks from happening. And I believe that with all my being, and that's why I'm here this morning to visit with you.